to the one that's on the P file, drag it to our folder.
And then I'm going to go into my folder into 2510. And wherever I put my P drive, oh, right there. There's my 2016 folder. I'm just going to copy that, delete the one on the P drive, and paste mine in place of it. Okay, and then I can open up Maya, and then my preferences should be there. Every time you come in, you should get in the habit of doing that. Delete your preferences that were on the P drive, copy the ones from your folder, and put them where that one was. Okay? So if you're at the same spot that we are, then you can just keep following along. Otherwise, you can just take notes. The first thing we want to do every time we come into Maya, we never want to just go find our file and double click it and start opening. Okay? So if I go to my P drive and I find my folder, I go into the scenes and I see that I have my Sarcona solar system here. I don't want to double click this to open it, because what happens is Maya doesn't know what I'm working on. It knows the file, but it doesn't know the project I'm working on. Okay? So what I need to do is I need to go to File and say Set Project. Okay? And then I tell Maya what project I'm working on. So I go to the P drive. I go to my folder. I find my SpaceScene. And then I hit Set. Okay? I don't need to go into the SpaceScene. I just go right to that SpaceScene folder, Sarcona Space, and hit Set. Now my project is set. Now Maya knows you're working on the space project. And then I can go to File Open and tell it what scene I'm working on. I'm working on the Sarcona_solar system. Okay? So your workflow every time you come into class, or every time you even start work at home, is to delete your old preferences, put your updated preferences in place. Then open up Maya, set your project, and then open up the scene that you're working on. Okay? So this is where we left off last time, is that we added some basic materials to our object. I animated a camera. Okay. So then what I want to do is, if I go through, I'm just going to show you this. If I go to, let's say, here, and I hit the render button. Oops, wrong one. There's several buttons up here. There's one with a little eye. Okay, the one with the eye just means open up the viewer. Okay, this is the viewer here, and it's just a quick way to get into the viewer without erasing what you've done. Remember I said that some of your renderings can take like hours and hours to do? So if we rendered this and it took, let's say, an hour to do, we wouldn't want to click the render button again, because it would erase what we've done and re-render it. So we would click the I one just to pop open this thing again. Okay, this one here, the one next to the I one, is the render what's in my scene button, where it renders what's in your scene. This next one is IPR, and it means interactive photorealistic rendering. And you don't do this, I'm just going to show you what it does. But it shows me a grayscale or a wireframe version of this, and then I can marquee a section. And what Maya does is it interactively is going to allow me to update this object. So if I click on this object here, I go to the material. It's kind of hard to do on the one screen. And I start updating stuff. You'll see how Maya automatically, without me having to re-hit that render button, will go through and just update all the material stuff. So I can very quickly kind of see what this is going to look like closer to a realistic phase. Now, we don't use that a whole lot because of two reasons typically. Number one, every time we render this, what happens is it's kind of like a layer in Photoshop. It just adds another layer on top of it and on top of it. And pretty soon you end up with one file that's like a gigabyte or 2 gigabytes because of all these iterations that we've done to it. Okay? And then the second reason is that sometimes this just stops working. And you may not notice it, but you're adjusting stuff there, and this view is not going to look the same. So I recommend that you just use the regular render button just to actually render your stuff out and see what it looks like. Okay. So far, nothing in this class is at the level of needing to go anything, more streamlined. Okay. The next button is this one with a gear, and that's our render settings. Okay. We'll get into that in a minute. And then the final one up here, this little round ball one, is our hypershade. This is where all of our materials go, right? And I think we played with that a little bit last time, just kind of showing some of the materials. All right, so this is where I'm at. Now, what I wanted to show was, even though we're dealing with spheres, you can see that the right side of this, there's no lighting. The right side of this, there's no lighting. On that other sphere, there's no lighting. In our scene, what we have is, by default, you get a directional light. Okay, so you get a light that shines from one direction, kind of like the sun, and just goes in whatever direction it is your camera is facing, basically. Okay, and that way you get some sort of shading on it. So if I were to, just to show it, if I were to spin around here and render it like this, I would still get that same exact lighting setup. Okay, so what happens though is that when we go through and we do a render, an actual render, not just these previews that we're doing, it locks that light. So if we're here, I'll use my cam, if we're here and our light is shining from this view like this, okay, and our camera comes in like this, the lighting looks pretty good. But then as we start to spin around the object, our lighting gets worse and worse and worse, and pretty soon we're in the black and we can't see anything from that backside. Okay, so we never ever want to stick with just default lighting because it's typically horrible lighting. So we're going to create our own lights. So we're going to go to Create, Lights, and we're going to create a directional light. Okay, and then you can move it and scale it up enormous. Okay, so just move it out of underneath the other planet and then scale it up until it's enormous. All light going in the same direction. Okay, light typically doesn't go in the same direction. Usually it starts at a source and goes outward. Okay, so like the sun or a light bulb goes outward from the center, right? Yes. A spotlight goes outward, but we have a cone that kind of directs it into a certain spot. A directional light is everything is just kind of like a big sheet from the same direction. Okay. Now the arrows are pointing at what gets lit up. So if we hit 7 on our keyboard, we'll see a preview of what the light is lighting up. Now what we want to do is have kind of like some just overall lighting from several sides of this. Okay, so I'm just going to rotate the light, and you'll see how it lights up different parts of this. And then I can duplicate it with Control D and rotate it around to cover some of the other areas that might not be getting lit up as much. We don't want the lights to be the same intensity because it looks kind of weird to have two lights of the same intensity. Kind of like washes it out. So it doesn't matter which one you pick. Make one of your lights 0.8 or 0.7 intensity. Okay, so you can hit Control A to get the attribute editor. Okay, and you just type 0.7 for the intensity of one of the lights. And then you could even, offset that one a little bit, duplicate that light again, and add a third light in there if you find a spot where you're just like, I'm not really happy with the way that light looks. And maybe make that light 0.25 or so. There you go. So I've created 4 lights in my scene. 2 of them are really low intensity, and then I have like a 0.7, then I have a 1. And what that gives me is just some nice overall lighting on those. Okay, now with these lights, we want to test it out. So of course we want to hit the render button and see what it looks like. Okay, if the light's too strong, I can go through and just grab one of the lights and knock its intensity down. What you don't want to do is totally wash it out, but you have to play that game of making sure you're able to see your items and all that. Now, one thing I'm getting on mine is I'm also getting shadows. So by default, all the lights are going to come in with shadows turned on. We don't want shadows on any of our lights. All we want is just light information, okay? So what I can do is I have a list of items, right? I have 4. In my case, I have 4 directional lights. You might have 3, you might have 2, whatever. In my case, I have 4 directional lights. I want to turn shadows off on each one. I can go through and click on the one light, scroll down to shadows in the attribute editor, and then uncheck use ray trace shadows. Okay, that's one way that I can turn my shadows off. The other way I can do it is by grabbing all my lights, using the channel box, and in here it says use ray trace shadows, and I can just type 0 for off, and now they're all off. Okay, so there's several ways to do it. Typically, if there's a list of things, I'll use the channel box. If it's just one thing, I'll use the attribute editor. Okay. All right, so we'll pretend that wherever you're at, you're good with it. Okay, we can always come back and change this stuff. So now that we have lighting in our scene, okay, take note of whichever camera it is that's moving. So in my case, at the very bottom of my screen, I see this persp1, okay? That persp1 right here in my viewport allows me to see which camera it is that's moving. Because when we go to render, I want to render the one that's moving, not one of the other ones that's just standing still. So I'm going to hit stop. I'm going to go to my render settings. Remember that little gear up at the top? And we're going to set up our render settings. Okay, these settings are going to be pretty standard throughout everything that we do. There may be an addition here or there, but typically it's going to be the same thing. Starting at the very top of our common tab, we're going to go to File Output and go to File Name Prefix, and we're going to erase what they have there. So we just erase all that information under File Name Prefix, and we put our name. So Sarcona _ space, enter. Okay, so erase what they have there and put your last name _ space. All right, so what this means is that when we render our files out, their files are going to be called Sarcona _ space, or whatever your last name is. Hopefully you didn't write Sarcona in there. Under image format, this is what's going to come out. This is the kind of image that we're going to get. You'll see from here there's a huge list of different file formats that can come out of this. EXR is a great format. It was actually developed by ILM, and it allows you to store a lot of information in one file, which is really awesome. Okay, the compressor is zips. We can leave it at that. And then here's where people usually forget, is this frame animation extension. Right now it's set to name.extension, meaning we would get a single frame. Okay, that means if we hit the actual go ahead and render button, we would get one frame out of this whole sequence. And we don't want that. We want to get a movie. We want to get every single frame that we animated, we want rendered out. So we're going to change this to name.extension or name.number.extension, okay, or name.hashtag.extension. Okay, so that third one from the top, name.number.extension, is the one you want to choose. So what that means is that when we render, it's going to be called Sarcona underscore space, that's the name, dot, which is just a period, right? And then the number is whatever frame we're on. So when it renders frame 2, it'll be Sarcona underscore space, dot 2, dot, and then the extension EXR. Okay? And when it does 3, it'll do the name.3.exr, name.4.exr, and so on. Okay? So we'll scroll down, and then under frame range, this is how many frames this animation is. So I have 120 frames in my animation. I know that because my timeline goes to 120 frames. That's how long we've animated. So I'm rendering starting at frame 1, going to frame 120. Okay? And then the camera I'm rendering is whichever one you're rendering. I'm rendering perspective 1. Okay? If you didn't make a new camera, you will be rendering perspective. Further down the list, we have our image size. Remember I said we're rendering everything at 960 by 540, so that stays exactly the way it is. Okay? There's nothing to change there. All right, so that's good. Everything's good there. Okay. So now we're going to go to the Quality tab. And in the Quality tab, they've actually simplified it quite a bit. Okay? There's just typically one slider, which is overall quality. It goes from 0.25 up to 2. And we could even type in other numbers. Okay? Now, I don't recommend you type in anything higher than 2 unless your scene absolutely needs it. All right? When you get into stuff like hair and fur and skin spots where you can see like the little grains on someone's face, that's where you really need to add a lot more resolution to this or a lot more quality. For what we're doing, 2 is going to be plenty. Okay. There's also lighting quality. We do basic lighting, so we should be fine there. And there's some other stuff that we could play with, but everything else is going to be fine. Okay. And then I think everything else should be good. Yep, everything else should be good. All right. So we can close that tab. Or close that window. And now we're going to actually go through and tell Maya, go ahead and render this thing. I want to see what it's going to look like. So we go to the space bar, which is the hot box. We hold it down. We go to the render, which is on the very bottom. And we go to the batch render option box. There it is. Batch render option box. Okay. Now what that does, it pops open the render options for the batch render. On these computers, they have dual quad-core processors in them. That means that they have 2 processors. Each processor has 4 cores to it. So essentially we have 8 processors. Okay. Maya will use all 8 processors. That's what we want it to do. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to say auto render threads is off. And we want to use 12 processors. Okay. Now this makes no sense at all of why this works. But if we leave it to the default of just use all of them, sometimes it won't use all of them. Okay. So I'm telling it to use 12, and sometimes it makes it use all of them. Yes, sir.
Mine started on manually rendering. I picked up that
That's fine. You did not go to the option box. You went to here, not there. Okay. So just for future. Okay. There's some other options inside here too. Verbosity level, which is like warning messages and whatever else you want to get. Typically, that's all we have to do. We turn the auto render threads off. We set this to 12, and we say batch rendering close. Okay. So now what should be happening is Maya should be going in the background. We don't see anything happening, and rendering our stuff out. All right. Under Window General Editors, open up the script editor. Window General Editor Script Editor. Inside here, this is where you'll see progress as to what is actually rendering out. Okay? Now it might seem like it's going pretty quick. On mine, you'll see that it's at 75, 85, 95, 100%, and then it starts back over again. Okay? That 100% is for that specific frame. It goes to frame 1, renders it out. Frame 2 renders it out. Frame 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way down the line, all the way to 120. Okay. Now 120 frames at 24 frames a second gives us how many seconds of animation? It was 5. Okay, so 5 seconds of animation. Now you take that to ILM or Pixar or any of the other ones, and they're doing 2 hours, 2.5 hour movies where they're rendering stuff out. Takes a long time. So on the far right, that's the number to kind of pay attention to. Right now I'm on frame 10, C0010. So that's how I know which frame I'm at. So basically now it's just a waiting game. It's just a matter of waiting to see when this thing gets done. Another important thing to kind of pay attention to is where these files are going. Because right now, somewhere inside this magical box on the floor, my files are being written somewhere. And when it's done, I need to be able to go find those files. So do you see where your files are going? Mm-hmm. Okay. My files are going into P, Sarcona 2510, work, Sarcona space, images, Sarcona space, 0015. Okay. So that's where my files are going. Now, just for fun, I'm going to wait. Once you hit render, my just starts dragging the entire station down. I'm going to cancel my rendering. You're going to let yours keep going. I'm going to cancel my rendering and show you what people typically don't do. Okay. So when you come in the morning and you have not set your project, you have no idea who was working on this station before you. So for instance, let's say, there we go. All right, so now I don't know where my project is set to. I go to batch render. I open up my script editor. And then we wait for it to get started. Okay. Yes, sir. All right, so now look at where my files are going. Advanced rendering, class 4 Skull Studio images. Okay? So if you don't set your project, you're basically taking a gamble as to where your stuff is going to end up. Now imagine that, let's say this is Mike's file, and Mike comes in and he sees all of your stuff in his folder. Mike might be a nice guy and say, oh, that's probably that guy's, and drop them into your folder. Or Mike might be a jerk and just wipe all your stuff out. Okay? And if it took you 3 days to render your stuff is now gone. There's no way to get that back. So you want to make sure that your stuff is in the exact spot that your stuff should be located. Okay? So you always want to make sure that you set your project. So I'm going to cancel my rendering again. I'm going to hit yes. I'm going to set my project again and render it again. There we go. Okay. Now there is a way for me to tell it to pick up where it left off, but I'm not concerned about that at this point. So what I want to do is wait for this to get started. I want to wait until this list starts going again, because once it starts going, then my rendering is actually started. Until that point, it's just kind of getting ready to render. Okay. So now what I want you to do is down here in your taskbar, see that little blue bar on the very bottom of your screen? I want you to right click in the taskbar and go to start the task manager. Okay. The task manager is where all the stuff that Windows is doing shows up. The top left tab, which is applications, these are all the applications that are running. I have Maya running, output window, my Camtasia recorder is running, and I have my scenes folder open. So all 4 of these are open. If you go to your processes tab, these are all the individual background things that are going on. Okay. Click on the memory, the word memory. Click on that one. Now what we should see is there's 2 at the very top. One of them is probably Maya, and the one below it is probably Maya batch. Okay, or vice versa, but typically those 2 are going to be the ones that are going to eat up the most memory. Looking at the Maya batch, See how I have a number in one of the columns that says 96, and then it says 97, then it says 56, then it says 23. That's how much of my processor it's using, okay? So if I have 8 processors in there, it's using 100% of them, almost 100%, right at the very end. See, it's at 97%, 97%, 43%. If this stays at like 25 or doesn't get above 30, that means you're not using all your processors. And that means that you should cancel the rendering and then start the rendering again. And sometimes that just gives Maya the extra kick. Now I could also see that under performances, if I look there, I can see there's the 8 processors, and that's how much Maya is using. At some of these big studios, they have computers that are just dedicated just to rendering. That's what they buy these computers for. So they buy the stuff for, is just to render stuff out. Okay. So once I know that this is rendering, I know that I've hit close to 90s or above 90s. I have to do something to the station to make sure that the next person that comes in can still use it. Because after you guys leave, another class comes in. And if that class can't render, or can't work, they're just going to close your Maya down or reboot the computer or whatever. So I want you to right click on Maya Batch, go to Set Priority, and do it below normal. Okay? So right click on Maya Batch, Set Priority, below normal. And it'll say, do you sure you want to do this? And you say, yep, change priority.
Mine said it couldn't do it.
This Maya Batch is actually a separate program that opens up. So when you are in Maya and you're working, and then you say render this item, what happens is it goes to the computer, or it goes to the folder, and opens up a brand new program called Maya Batch. And Maya Batch will go through and it does all the stuff that it needs to do. And then when it's done, it just closes automatically. Okay? So cool thing about that is that there's a separate program that does it. By right-clicking and setting this priority below normal, what that does is it says, as long as nobody's using the computer, use 100% of the processor. But once someone comes on the computer and they start going around and they start, working, I'm going to YouTube to work. It won't affect their performance, okay? So as far as I know, I don't have anything else running. I'm able to go to YouTube pretty quickly. I'm able to go to Amazon pretty quickly. I can probably open up Photoshop. And the whole while that I'm doing this Maya Batch is just like sitting in the background waiting for that person to stop working, basically. It doesn't halt its operation. It just works a lot slower. Once they're done and they've closed Photoshop and they've closed Firefox or Chrome or whatever they're using, then it jumps itself back up to 100%. And it starts going, as much as it needs to for that. Okay? So that's what that set priority does by setting it below normal. Now you might think, get it to render faster, I should just set this to real time. That way it renders in real time. No. These are the 3 most pointless buttons I've ever seen in Windows. They do nothing except for bring the computer to a halt. If you go above normal, which is the default, it just like everything stops working. So don't do that. Only go to normal or below normal. Sometimes I'll even go to low, and if it's really like clogging the system. Okay? And sometimes I'll even do this, which is set affinity. Setting the affinity means I'm actually going to pick which processors are get used by the system. Okay? So just for information, typically your Windows is going to run on 0 and 1. That's typically the processors that your computer is going to run on while it's working. So if I disabled these two, Windows would run perfectly fine. Maya would never even touch those 2 processors. Okay, and most people would never even notice anything's going on. But sometimes if they are on, even with set priority set to below normal, sometimes you'll still get like a performance hit. Typically, it's nothing to worry about. Okay. So when you render anything inside this class, make sure you go in here and do the set priority below normal so your stuff doesn't get killed. Then the other thing, we also have these. So this is what you would put on your desk. So when you render something, you just put that like on the keyboard, and hopefully the person coming in doesn't turn off your computer. If they turn it off, your rendering stops, and you have to restart it. Okay? So we just want them to know, because they shouldn't be affected in the computer, that they are rendering something, don't turn it off. And typically they're savvy enough and understand enough to say, I'm not going to turn off your computer unless it's really affecting them. Now they have, if you're rendering something where we're using mental ray, okay? If they come in at 5 o'clock and they want to render something and they're using mental ray, one of the sucky things is it won't let them, okay? So if that's the case, they will shut your stuff down and start up their own stuff so they could render. So just be aware of that. That sometimes you have to come in on a Friday or a Saturday and render your stuff over the weekend, or take your stuff home and render from home just to make sure that your stuff doesn't get turned off or whatever. Okay? Now while this is rendering, you always want to check it as well. I'm going to use a tool called DJV. It's a free utility. That's weird. And what you do is you just find your file. So somewhere on here, I think it's on my P drive, Sarcona there, 2510, work, space, images, clear. Here's my sequence, 0001 to 64. And there it is, okay? So now I can preview this. Now the workflow is typically that we would, after we're done rendering, we would take that into After Effects and make it into an actual movie, okay? And eventually we'll do that, but for now we're just going to leave it as it is. Okay? Now let's say we had an error here, we didn't like something. Oops, I forgot to texture the sun or whatever it is. I can cancel my rendering, go back into Maya, fix all this stuff up, hit render again, and it outputs it and overwrites all these files. Okay? So at any point, don't think of this as I start here and I work until I get to the end and then I'm done. Think of it like in passes. You know, you kind of do like a broad pass and come back and refine and refine and refine until you have something that is good enough to turn in. Okay? So at any point, you can come back and tweak the look of the planets. We can come back and tweak the look of the sun. We can add a space scene in the background. We could add rocket ships flying through here. We could add aliens. We could add whatever to this scene. Okay? And typically that's how they would do it in a Hollywood-like production, where they're showing different things happening, right? Because they're adding different elements to make it look more realistic. All right, wonderful. All right. All right, so let your stuff render today.